Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Under Lockdown, Diet and Health Behaviours in a Pandemic, brought to you by the Zoe COVID Symptom Study. I'm Chris Brunner, Head of Content and Communications for the study, and I'll be your host today. We're using Slido to take your questions. If you want to add a new question or upvote someone else's, just visit the link on your screen. The link's also being shared on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll do our best to get round to as many questions as we can. You can also answer our polls here. There is one published. Just toggle from the Q&A to polls at the top of the screen in Slido. Now for our first poll, and it's available at the Slido link, as I said, so cast your mind back to March last year and remember those days of supermarket panic buying. Which caused more disruption for you? Toilet paper or pasta? Which was more difficult to get hold of? Perhaps it was something else. Have your say, and the link has been sent out on our social media, as we say. So this webinar focuses on the preliminary findings of a study we ran with the Zoe COVID Symptom Study users during the first wave of the pandemic. We asked questions about what lockdown had done to your eating, sleeping, and exercise habits, and it's since become the largest study of its kind with over 1 million contributors. And thank you if you took part in this. We'll discuss the findings looking at 3 specific areas. Firstly, the scale of the disruption COVID has brought to our daily lives. Secondly, what we found out about the different ways individuals responded to the disruption. And finally, we'll explore why some groups were more disrupted than others. Please remember when submitting questions to Slido to try and focus your questions on these themes. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. So if my panel could please bring their videos up. Firstly, we have Dr. Sarah Berry. She's a reader in nutritional sciences and a nutrition scientist at King's College London. She's also the lead nutrition scientist at Zoe and led the diet and lifestyle study that we'll be discussing today. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And Professor Christopher Gardner is a nutritional scientist of medicine at Stanford Medical School. He's also part of Zoe's scientific advisory board. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks for having me.
And Rebecca Toby joins us from the Food Foundation. The Food Foundation is a UK charity on a mission to change food policy and business practice to ensure everyone can afford and access a healthy diet. Rebecca is also a registered associate nutritionist, and she leads the Peas Please initiative at the charity. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi.
So, Sarah, you led the study that we'll be discussing today. Can you give us just first of all a quick overview of the methodology that you used?
Yeah, certainly. So in order for us to understand how the pandemic had affected our health behaviours, we launched, as Chris said, this detailed diet and lifestyle survey into the app. And we invited all of our participants to complete the questionnaire at 2 different time points. So firstly, for before the pandemic, which was in February of last year, and then again for July in the UK or September if you were a US participant. And we asked the participants questions relating to 3 key areas. Firstly, their lifestyle, such as sleep and physical activity. Secondly, their dietary habits. So questions around how they eat, such as snacking frequency or timing of meals, alcohol consumption, supplement use, and much more. And then thirdly, we asked them about their diet quality, so what they eat. And we did this using a validated food frequency questionnaire, which asked about the frequency of consumption of more than 20 different food groups, such as fruits and vegetables or fish and dairy and many more. We're really lucky to have more than 1 million people respond to the questionnaire, making it the world's largest and most detailed diet and lifestyle questionnaire, which for me as a nutritionist is beyond exciting. And I think Christopher Gardner can vouch for that. And this has enabled us to really unravel how the pandemic's impacted our health behaviours. And we're going to go through some of this data in today's discussion. I do want to just make you aware that the findings have not yet undergone peer review before we actually go through this data. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And as you say, I mean, those million respondents came through the COVID symptom study. So again, just thank you very much to our users and those of you who are on the webinar now who took part in the study. So I want to talk a little bit about this disruption index. And then this brings us around to our first topic, the scale of disruption that COVID caused. So Sarah, can you just again talk us through how you measured disruption?
Yeah, so I think firstly, I'd just like to say why we measured disruption, because we know that at an individual level, significant life events such as bereavement or loss of a job, for example, are associated with changes in health behaviours, whether this be alcohol intake, sleep, diet, physical activity. And all of these, can come together to negatively impact our health by impacting factors such as body weight, as well as a whole host of other factors. And so the pandemic has really allowed us to examine the impact of a lifestyle disruptor on our health by creating this really unique experiment at a global scale. And so what we wanted to do is quantify the lifestyle disruption that we were seeing due to the pandemic. So we developed this novel disruption index, like we said, which consisted of 5 different metrics, so 5 different measures. And these were diet quality, alcohol frequency, physical activity, snacking frequency, and by snacking we mean food consumed outside of main meals, and also weekday sleep duration. And we selected these particular 5 metrics to capture the really primary diet and lifestyle behaviours that we know are associated with many different health outcomes. Now, the disruption index that we created was independent of direction of change, and this is really important to think about when we're discussing this over the next 5 to 10 minutes. So regardless of whether you increased or decreased one of these variables, whether it be sleep, diet quality, alcohol, for example, you would get a point for each change. So you would get a point whether you went up or you went down. So you could get a maximum of 5 if all 5 variables changed, and a minimum of 0 if none of these changed. What we found was that the majority of people did actually experience some level of disruption. And we found that about 2/3 of people experienced disruption in more than 2 of these measures. And I think really interestingly, when we actually looked at who was most disrupted, we found that the highest disruption was actually seen in younger females and those living in more deprived areas. And we also saw some small differences in terms of geographical regions, but the most pronounced differences were this kind of big increase in disruption in younger individuals and more so in females.
That's interesting. So, Rebecca, I guess it comes as no surprise to you that young women and those living in deprived areas experience more disruption than others?
Yeah, I think certainly what we've seen throughout the pandemic is that certain groups within the population have been adversely affected much more than others by the impact of the pandemic. And I think when it comes to women, I mean, even before COVID, we know that women tend to do a greater share of housework and childcare, the so-called second shift. But I think with the pandemic and schools shutting and support networks being much more limited, the second shifts almost become the all day and the all night shift for a lot of women. So I think particularly younger women who are perhaps more likely to have children have probably been disrupted as a result. And I think in terms of people from from more deprived areas, I think the economic impact of the pandemic has certainly had a really significant effect. And what's interesting is that there's an overlap with age as well. So we know that younger people have been much more likely to have been furloughed, but also to have been made redundant. So there was a piece of data from the ONS the other week that showed if you're in the kind of 16 to 34-year-old age band, you were 5 times more likely to have been made redundant as people in sort of older age bands. And I think there's a lot of overlap there when it comes to people from more deprived areas. So again, much more likely to have been furloughed or to have been made redundant if you're in a lower income job rather than a higher paid profession. And so I think, there's been a lot more disruption and pain that perhaps certain groups have felt than others.
Thank you. That's interesting. So looking at these five areas, so diet quality, alcohol frequency, physical activity, snacking frequency, and weekday sleep duration. So Christopher, the disruption index is a pretty novel way to get a sense of just how much our lives are being shaken up during this first lockdown. And it's interesting that snacking's in there among those 5 factors. Why is snacking particularly important?
I would say as a nutritionist that snacking has been a topic of tremendous interest over the last couple of decades as we tie that to obesity, because stepping back from the pandemic, what's really been an interesting trend is in the past, you couldn't have a snack in a library, you couldn't have a snack in a department store, there were a bunch of things that were socially unacceptable for snacking, and they've changed tremendously. Now the library has its own coffee shop, and pastry shop. You can eat anywhere, anytime. And so this sort of day-long grazing has been considered a problem. So think about this. Now a lot of people have been staying at home instead of going into work. And so instead of taking that mid-afternoon break where you have a 20-ounce mocha frappa crappuccino and a muffin, that's 1,000 calories that you're not having socially with your friends, although you're at home. And maybe you're terrified with everything that's going on, and you're curled up on a couch with a bag of chips, and you're just binge watching television, and you're eating all day long. So the dynamics have shifted of what's appropriate and what opportunities you have to snack. So I'm really not surprised that in this changing dynamic, we've seen disruption in both directions, some snacking less, but I think, Sarah, correct, more of them were snacking more? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, we'll come on to this. We had a slight increase in the number of people with snacks, but I think that I'd quite like to just jump in with a point that I think is often overlooked by people about snacks, that typically when we think of snacks, we think of unhealthy foods. And, you know, there's two different ways to categorize snacks. It's to either categorize them as being foods consumed between meals or foods that we think of traditional snacking foods. And I think it's really important to say that, you know, you can actually snack on healthy foods. You can snack on, you know, nuts. There are ways to still snack if you are a grazer and if that's how it suits you to consume foods, and that we're not necessarily saying that snacking is bad. It's about choosing, making the right snack for you.
And Sarah, you've got a paper on that recently, looking at almonds as a way to snack. And if you're home, right, so you may not be tempted by some of those commercial opportunities for snack. You might have stocked your home with carrots and hummus and almonds and things like that, and taken advantage of the pandemic. That was a great point to clarify.
Okay, so let's take a look at this in terms of what those 5 disrupting factors did to weight in both the US and the UK. Sarah, can you explain these graphics for us, please?
Yeah, so I think it's really first important to say that overall we saw very little average change in weight in the participants, so in our population. But what we saw is that although the average didn't change, we saw that the change in weight was highly variable between individuals. So to look at how disruption may be impacting our weight change, what we did was we separated out people according to whether they experienced a high or a low level of disruption. And then we plotted their changes in weight in these waterfall charts, which is shown here. And the red or orange line represents people who experienced a really high level of disruption. And then the blue lines are those who experienced a really low level of disruption during the pandemic. And each one of these individual lines that you see here on this waterfall plot represents 1% of the participants in either the UK here on the left or the US on the right. So each line in the UK, for example, is about 3,000 participants. And I think what's really apparent from this figure is just how much variability there was in weight change. And this is in either direction. So this is either increase, which is above that y-axis, or weight loss, which is the lines that are going below that x-axis. And this is really interesting, I think, because what this is also showing here is that those that were more disrupted, so remember, these are the ones in the orange and the red, had greater variability in weight change. So they gained or they lost more weight than those who were less disrupted. But the similar level of gain and loss shows that the disruption isn't necessarily negative. So it can actually be a catalyst, for positive change. It isn't that everyone that was highly disrupted experienced weight gain. We saw it in either direction. I think that's really important to hold in our minds as well as we discuss some of this data.
And it's interesting that, a lot of the conversations we've had about this research is that everybody responds really differently. And when you look at these graphics, they are almost sort of mirrored across both countries, for one, but also those who lost weight and those who gained weight. There seems to be quite a lot of mirroring going on here. So there's almost the opposite impacts on people. What do you think's behind that?
So I think how everyone's responds to the pandemic is so variable, and I think it's down to each individual's personal experienced during the pandemic, whether it's differences in the time that they have, whether it's differences in like the food access and all these other factors that we can go on to look at. I think what I find quite interesting here is that we don't see quite as much of an exaggerated difference between the low and high disruption between the UK and the US population. And, I'm not sure why that is. I don't know whether, Christopher, this is something that you can comment on, why we're not seeing such big differences, given that as a population, the participants in the UK and the US were broadly similar in this survey.
Yeah, I certainly can't explain that differential in gap. I totally appreciate some below the line and some above the line. We see that again and again and again, but it is fascinating that the differential between the UK is bigger than the US. I have to look into it more.
And Christopher, why do you think weight gain is and weight loss is so tightly coupled to disruption? Is it really that, does our weight shift a lot depending on how disrupted our lives are?
Oh, absolutely. Right. So you can easily gain a pound or two or lose a pound or two every month. And this is over that frame of time. Sorry, a kilo. Sorry for being from the US. Yep. So if you change that habit, if you're all of a sudden have more time and you decided one of the ways you're going to handle the pandemic is to take a little more control of your life and get out there and exercise more frequently and cook for yourself more frequently, the benefits are there. And if the disruption has just caused you to throw up your arms and say, at this point in time, I really need comfort food. I really need to sit on the couch. I really need to de-stress. And I'm going to do that with food, which is the way a lot of people find comfort. It'd be easy to put those pounds on over a couple of months. Just two different directions to the same perturbation in your life as people handle it differently. Totally makes sense.
And Rebecca, is losing weight, I mean, it's easy to look at these and kind of look at people who lost weight, that's a good thing, and people who gain weight, that's a bad thing. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, I think we're often quite quick to assume that any weight loss is a good thing. But, as Christopher was saying, I think, and probably most people listening would be able to say which camp they're in. But, in times of stress or anxiety or bereavement, people either go, use food as an emotional coping mechanism, or you just feel nauseous the whole time and can't think of anything worse than eating, which probably explains some of the results here. But I think certainly as well, we know in amongst older people, mal or undernutrition, sarcopenia, so muscle loss is a significant issue among that community and really does impact on quality of life. But I think what's also interesting to me is that I noticed that younger women in particular reported losing the most amount of weight. And we know that certainly eating disorders have thrived during the pandemic. And there are really quite distressing reports of how much calls to eating disorder charities have increased during this period of time. And so I think that's maybe one interesting way that you could sort of interpret these results, is that potentially, we know that eating disorders are particularly prevalent among younger women. In fact, Sarah, is that something you looked at, sort of how eating habits and disordered eating had been impacted on?
So we actually only had one question in the survey on this. We had a question to ask people whether they worry about having lost control over how much they're eating. In an ideal world, we would have had a whole questionnaire around this, but it's always a case, as with all research, of balance between participant burden versus what we want to get out of it. What we did see, though, from that question is that there was a small increase in the UK in how many people were worried about losing control about how much they're eating. And this is bi-directional, so it's just about losing control, whether it's kind of eating more or less. But actually we saw this was much bigger in the US. So we saw about a 3% increase in worry in the UK, but we saw about a 10 to 15% increase in the US. So a lot more people in the US were worried about this. Why, I don't know. Christopher, I don't know whether you've seen this data, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know whether you could speculate on maybe why it's more so in the US than the UK.
Well, perhaps because politically we've been a mess, right, for the last year plus during this whole thing, and there was a real lack of unified message. So there's just tremendous frustration at sort of no nationally unified response to this, and states were responding very differently, and it was just moving too fast. People were frustrated that the leaders weren't in control of what was going on. That's my best crack at that.
It's interesting to think about the different political spheres going on in the two countries. Sarah, we're just getting a few questions from the audience about disruption index, just to make sure that everybody understands that. I was going to have a go at explaining it, but probably a lot better if you do. Would you mind just again explaining disruption index for the audience?
Yeah, should we go back to that slide as well, just so that we can see that? Okay, so the disruption index took 5 key areas that we measured within our questionnaire. It took diet quality, which is a composite measure of diet that we got from the FFQ. So this 26-item food frequency questionnaire, we got from it a single measure of diet quality. We also looked at alcohol frequency, we looked at physical activity, then we had the question on snacking frequency and weekday sleep duration. And what we did was we allocated a score of 1 for each of these. And if you changed any of these during the pandemic, so looking at your during pandemic measurement versus pre-pandemic, if any of these changed, whether they went up or down, you would get given a score of 1 for each variable. So for an example, if my diet quality changed and got better, I would get a score of 1. If my alcohol went down, I would get a score of 1. If my physical activity didn't change, I would get no score. If my snacking frequency went up, I'd get a score of 1. If my sleep didn't change, I'd get a score of 0. That would mean together, that would give me a disruption index of 3 out of 5. And so everyone was allocated a disruption index on a scale of 0 to 5, with 5 being the most disrupted and 0 being the least disrupted.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope that that helps the members of the audience who were asking about disruption index. So we're going to move on now to this individualistic response that we saw. So this is really the second topic of what we want to talk about. So how individuals responded differently in the pandemic. The results of the study showed that while there was no change really at a population level, there was a huge variation in individual diet and behavior change. So Sarah, for many of these factors, there's almost an equal increase and decrease, but there are a few exceptions, of course. So what surprised you most about the findings here?
I think if I'm honest, I was expecting most people to have changed their habits unfavorably. This is what we've seen a lot of in the press, how, you know, the pandemic has been terrible for us. We're all becoming even lazier, we're eating even worse, etc. Obviously, depending on what press you're reading, maybe. But I was actually surprised, firstly, to see how little mean change there was. So how little change on average there was in the population in nearly all of the measures. But at the same time, how large some of the individual level changes were, which again, really ties in with what we saw with the disruption index. And I was also surprised to see that, if anything, the tendency was for improved dietary changes. So what I've done here is just select out a few to illustrate the proportion of participants that have either increased or decreased, and some of the instances where we see a difference. In most of them, we saw equal numbers increasing and decreasing. So this is to illustrate where we see similar, but also where there's some interesting differences that I think we could discuss with Rebecca and Christopher maybe in a bit more detail. So as I've already mentioned before, there was approximately equal numbers of people who increased or decreased their weight, although the weight loss was slightly higher. So we had an average weight loss in those that were reducing their weight of 4 kilos versus an average gain of around 3.5 kilos. We found that 22% of people reported snacking less compared to 18% of people who reported increasing their snacking. So I actually got it the wrong way round, Christopher, when we were talking about this a minute ago. So more people decreased. So maybe these are the people that aren't getting their 1,000-calorie frappuccinos and are actually too busy at their computer or homeschooling to be grabbing their snacks. And I think really interestingly, we saw more people increasing their weekday sleep than decreasing their weekday sleep. And the increase that we saw in sleep, I think, is really relevant here, because we saw people were increasing from just under the recommended amount. So they had an average of about 6.9 hours of sleep in our population. and they were increasing it on average by about 70 minutes. So this was taking people well within the recommended amount. And this is really relevant from a health perspective. So I thought this was actually something quite interesting to touch on.
That is really fascinating, Sarah. I just want to ask you a question about that, because it almost suggests that potentially the lives we were leading before the pandemic in many ways were less healthy than perhaps the lives we're leading now.
Yeah, and I think there's some really great data that we can come on to as part of the third question in this podcast webinar. But I think on the sleep, what I find really interesting, and I've seen that there's quite a few questions coming in about on this on Slido, so I feel happy. I'd quite like to just expand a little bit about the sleep. We know that from a lot of cross-sectional work, so survey work that's been done outside of this questionnaire over the years, that people that sleep less than the recommended amount have unhealthier diets, and they have worse metabolic responses to food, which is actually what we've also seen in our PREDICT series of studies, where we've been looking at individual differences in how we respond to food. So we see they have unhealthier diets, we see that they have worse metabolic responses to food compared to people that sleep the recommended amount. And interestingly as well, work that's been done at King's College London by my colleagues has shown that if you can increase sleep, so if you increase the amount of sleep people are getting from below the recommended amount, just like we're seeing pre-pandemic with people here, to the above the recommended amount or within the recommended amount, as we're seeing during the pandemic here, we actually see an improvement in diet quality. We see a reduction in sugar consumption by about 10 grams by making this quite simple change. We see less cravings for refined carbs and sugar, etc. So this change in sleep that we've seen here, for those that are increasing, this amount that we see, this 70 minutes, is actually quite important from, I think, a health perspective and dietary intake perspective. And it could actually explain some of the differences we see, which we'll go on to talk about in some of the dietary measures that we took as well.
Look at something of these. Looking at some of these other figures on the screen here. So, Christopher, looking at weight gain and loss, 3.5 to 4 kilograms. Now, I understand that's metric. Maybe you can do the imperial conversion for us. But is that clinically relevant in terms of a swing?
Well, so first of all, let's realize, much as Rebecca was reminding us before, weight is really a pretty crude measure. There's adipose mass and there's lean muscle, right? And so some of the weight could be people staying at home and working out more. I got people in my neighborhood who have a home gym. Maybe they're actually putting on some muscle and losing some adipose tissue. If you go in the downward arrow, if this was someone who was losing weight inappropriately because of some eating disorders, that could be bad. I can just tell you most of my work happens to be in the field of cardiovascular disease with people who are overweight. And for somebody who is 80 kilos, a 4 kilo drop would be a 5% drop. Metabolically speaking, we see cholesterol levels clearing up, blood pressure going down, insulin and glucose control improving with a 5% drop. So if the question is that, potentially clinically relevant, it is. But we would have to tease apart, was that muscle mass or fat mass that was being lost, and for good reasons or not. And the beauty of this data set that Sarah and the rest of us have to play with now is that, as she's saying, we can link this weight loss or gain with diet quality and sleep and other factors. I think when we put it all together, we're going to have an even more fascinating picture of what's going on.
And we've also got two measures of alcohol here. So one being alcohol frequency and the other being alcohol levels of alcohol consumption. What do you think, Sarah, is interesting here? I mean, obviously, it looks like we're potentially drinking less in one sitting, but more frequently.
Yeah, so this is exactly what the data showed, which I think many people, certainly I can, vouch for, is that many of us we found were consuming alcohol more frequently, but at each sitting we were consuming less alcohol. So overall, over each week, the actual amount in units of alcohol consumed was actually broadly similar, but it was how we were consuming these. So instead of maybe our Thursday, Friday, Saturday night out, binge drinking, in both the UK and the US, we were more drinking, a little bit every night, but less at each sitting. And I think that's quite interesting. I think a lot of people can really relate to that, probably.
And the activity increase and decrease is also quite extreme. Christopher, what do you think? We've talked a little bit about how people's daily routines have changed a lot. Has that made a big impact, do you think, on the way people exercise?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just the opportunities to change in both directions are tremendous. And just the time factor for so many people, I assume it's the same in the UK, but with so many people working remotely. So I live in the San Francisco area where commutes are horrific and people are spending 2 hours a day in the car, and suddenly they had 4 hours going back and forth available. What did they do with those 4 hours? Some of them said, yes, I can sleep in. Yes, I can exercise now. Where others were paralyzed by concern over what was going on. So an opportunity to go in both directions, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, and what we saw though, Christopher, was that in the UK, we had an equal spread of people going in each direction. So we had an equal number of people increasing and an equal number decreasing. And those people increasing could be capitalizing on that less commute, and those decreasing, like myself, could be because they're juggling now 2 full-time jobs, being a full-time teacher to homeschooling kids plus a full-time researcher. But what we saw in the US actually was that a lot more people decreased than increased. And, I wonder whether you could give some sort of guess as to why that could be.
No, I'm embarrassed for my country. I think they just panicked too much. And I'm trying to think. I mean, also I live in California. During part of this, we had a wildfire thing where no one could go outside. And so there's a lot of different factors that are coming into play here. But it is fascinating that the rate of decrease in activity was greater in the US. We'll have to keep teasing apart those data. I don't have a good answer for that other than being embarrassed for my country.
Rebecca, well, one of the factors that we saw perhaps much more of a decrease than we saw an increase in is food access. What's the picture that the Food Foundation sees behind that particular statistic?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context, so we've been running a series of polls ever since last March, which basically we're aiming to sort of track exactly how the pandemic's affected food security. And certainly for a considerable number of people, food access has become that much harder, whether because of physical access, actually getting to the shops and getting enough food, which we know was more of an issue in the first few weeks following the pandemic's first few weeks following the first lockdown, when there were empty shelves in supermarkets, many people were sort of shielding or isolating. But over the course of the pandemic and as it's developed, we've seen sort of economic access issues, so problems affording enough food becoming an issue. And certainly certain groups within the population have disproportionately been affected by food security. So we know that 5.1 million adults have experienced food insecurity in the UK in the 6 months to August. So to give you sort of context, certainly in the first few weeks following the pandemic, that was a 4-fold increase on pre-pandemic levels. And those groups that have been worse affected are, families with children, those people living with disability or underlying health conditions, and also people of Black and multiple or mixed ethnicity backgrounds. And so it's interesting. So I can see it's sort of roughly 5% of people reported worsening food access here, but perhaps this speaks a little bit to the fact that the demographics of this sample are sort of majority white, tend to be sort of a bit older, so perhaps less likely to be living with children. And there's some really distressing stories, parents skipping meals so that their children can eat, or having to send their children to relatives. So we know that there are certain groups that have been disproportionately affected, and it might just be that they're not quite being captured within this sample. But I think, as you say, it's interesting that even here we can see more people have struggled to access food than sort of saw a change in the opposite direction.
I think, Rebecca, what's important to note, though, is that although it might seem small, this is actually still 65,000 people just from this questionnaire.
Yeah.
So if we were to extrapolate that to like that, we would probably get similar values to the 5.1, I think, the value that you mentioned.
Yeah, so it's 5.1 million adults, but actually, so over the course of so that's like a 9.7% of the population equivalent, which actually, you're right, isn't hugely far off where this study is.
But you are right that the demographics of the population in this survey is slightly different to the demographics of our general UK population. So we did tend to have people that were of a slightly higher socioeconomic class. We had slightly older individuals, we had more females, etc. So that all comes into play as well. So if we were to match, we would probably find that we actually have similar proportions.
Yeah, looks like it, doesn't it?
And I suppose one thing that we weren't able to look at in the Zoe study was the impact on children, and this is something that the Food Foundation is really involved in. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about Marcus Rashford's alliance of charities about ending child food poverty. And you guys were a major driver in getting the government to change to stand up and listen to the issues around what was happening with free school meals during the pandemic and things like that. What's been the impact on children when it comes to food access and security?
Not great. So yeah, as I mentioned, families with children and generally the more children, the worse the issues have been affected. So 14% of adults, according to our studies, living with children reported moderate or severe food insecurity in the 6 months to August 2020, which so that's 14%, and that compares to 11.5% pre-COVID. So there's clearly been an increase. And I think as well, what I thought was interesting was particularly single parent households have been at even higher risk of food insecurity. So at one point, single parent households were twice as likely to be food insecure. So there's definitely a problem when it comes to children and being able to provide for children, which, yeah, as you say, hasn't been picked up here, but that we know is a problem.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at the consumption of some particular foods that we asked about in the survey. Sarah, again, this shows how everyone responded very differently to the pandemic. There's some increasing their consumption of certain foods while others, it fell. There are some quite big swings here for fruit and vegetables, though.
Yeah, so what we did was with the questionnaire, we had embedded within it a food frequency questionnaire that enabled us to develop this diet quality index, which I mentioned earlier, fed into our disruption index, and then enabled us to look at 26 different food groups, for example, fruits and vegetables and some of the others I mentioned earlier. And we've just pulled out a few of these that I think are interesting. So fruits and vegetables, we saw a huge variability in how people increased or decreased their intakes. And we saw that a third of participants increased their fruits and vegetable consumption from an average of 3.5 portions to actually 5.6 portions a day. And this increase in the number of portions is really quite important, I think. And it's enough, in my opinion, and based on all the epidemiological evidence, to actually confer quite significant health benefits. So we're having just slightly more than 2 portions a day more for those that are increasing. And it's increasing from, roughly around the UK average to well above recommended amounts. The problem is on the flip side, we did see a quarter of participants, although this is less, we did see a quarter actually decrease their fruit and vegetable intake from about this kind of 5.5 portions to, about 3.8 portions a day. And I don't know whether, Chris, you want to jump in here and, put into perspective the amount of change, because I think this is what's important rather than just, how many people have changed, but this increase and decrease of greater than 2 portions either way, and how important this is actually for all of the different health outcomes that you often look at in your studies.
Yeah, and Arsa, if you look in the US across decades, fruit and vegetable intake hasn't changed at all. It's been about half of the recommendation. And so to see a jump of a third in some people who are somehow taking advantage of this opportunity and finding that they have the access to do this is really impressive. and frightening those who are dropping by almost a quarter, needing to look into how much of that is access and what are the other reasons responsible for that. But given how we haven't seen much change over decades, there may be some important lessons to be learned in here. So it'd be fun to dig a little deeper into what was causing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting as well as seeing these big changes in some of these healthy foods, such as fruits and veg, we see big swings in unhealthy foods. So, for example, we've got more people increasing their consumption of ice cream. Now, is that just because it's the time of year? Because we asked for the month of February 1st, and then we asked for July or September. Is that why? Is it people comfort eating? I don't know. I think something else that was really interesting here is that we saw a reduction in pasta intake. And so we saw that about 20% of people reported eating less pasta compared to only about 10% of people who increased. Now, I don't know how things were in the US, but in the UK, I think most people can vouch for the fact that you just couldn't get hold of pasta, as well as toilet roll, in our supermarkets. The shelves were bare of toilet roll, pasta, rice, flour. What was your kind of experience in terms of what was available to you in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. And, beans should have been the same way. Dried beans or quick, let's grab these in case we run out of food. We can always cook up some dry beans.
Yeah.
I think less people in the US are accustomed to eating dry beans and more of them are accustomed to eating pasta. And yes, the pasta was gone. The pasta sauce was gone for months even after things started to resolve. It was really hard to get a hold of these things. So I agree. Part of that was just the pandemic rush and hoarding.
Actually, it's a good time to bring in the results of our poll. So at the beginning of this webinar, we asked those watching to take part in a poll on Slido, asking whether or not they had more trouble getting toilet paper or pasta. From the results of that poll, just over almost 1,000 responses. So toilet paper, 37%. It's the most difficult thing to get hold of, apparently, during the first wave of the pandemic. Then 24% of people said neither of those things, followed by 21% people said pasta, and then actually another 17% of people said something else. So it'd be interesting to know what those other things were, but I think, Sarah, you mentioned a few of them just now. So we've got to move on to the next and third and final part of our presentation today. So we're looking really at why some people were disrupted more than others, and we have touched on this along the way. We already talked about young women and those in deprived areas being more heavily disrupted by the COVID pandemic and the resulting lockdowns. But one really interesting thing that the study shows is that those who did not previously adhere to a healthy lifestyle, so those who were a little less fit and healthy than others, or weren't living the lifestyle that we might really want to adhere to, were more likely to make beneficial changes during this time. Now, Sarah, I'm not sure you expected to see this from the research.
No, I didn't. For anyone that was watching news reports, there's been so much talk in the media around the pandemic widening disparities, so widening health disparities, which we know, and particularly in BAME communities. But I expected, really, based on what we've been seeing anecdotally, that we'd expect individuals who started off with a poor diet and poor lifestyle would get even worse, and that those that had a really good pre-pandemic diet and lifestyle would get even better. But like you said, we didn't see this. We actually saw almost a flip. So what we found was that people that were most adherent to an unhealthy diet and lifestyle behaviours before the pandemic in February, and important to note, regardless of their level of deprivation, so regardless of their socioeconomic status, these made the most improvements in their diet quality, in their physical activity levels, and in their body weight change in the direction of loss. Yet those people who are most adherent to a really healthy pattern in February before the pandemic, actually they just retained their behaviours. Now, this could be potentially, as I know, Christopher, you pointed out before to me, because is it that they had less wiggle room, so to say, that those that were already quite unhealthy had a lot of room for improvement, but those that were already healthy, didn't have much room for improvement? I'm not sure, but I do think it's important to note that regardless of the level of deprivation, we still saw an improvement. Now, it was attenuated, so the more deprived individuals starting off with an unhealthy lifestyle didn't get quite as the same level of improvement, but they still went in the same direction.
Yeah, I think this is a mix. Yep. I think part of that is having more room for improvement. But I tell you what is really interesting. And Sarah, can you remind me of the people that started with a healthy behavior versus unhealthy in this graph? Is there a third that isn't represented here that was in the middle? Were the ones who started with a healthy behavior sort of at the top third? Because what you would expect there is there's room to go down.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating that they're stable. And so if I'm saying there's room for improvement in the group that started low, there was also room for loss in the group that started high. So the fact that they're level is really pretty interesting. They did have less room for improvement, but there's got to be some people there that freaked out because of the pandemic. I would have actually expected the lines to cross because of the room for change. So I think it's really encouraging. And there's some really great lessons to be learned from the people who had room for improvement, had more time, slept more. What were the factors that allowed this to happen? Could be really informative moving forward.
Yeah, the way that we measured this is we separated people into what, those of you that are researchers will know are quartiles. So we separated people into 4 groups. So we separated people according to, if they were in quartile 4, they were the most adherent to the unhealthy diet, and quartile 1 were those that were least adherent to the unhealthy diet. And we did the same for the healthy diet. So we had 2 groups in the middle. Just like you mentioned, we had the quartile 2 and quartile 3 in the middle, and that's where we saw a lot of kind of bouncing around. And I think that's where you'll see that we have more of this kind of variability within there, and yet at the kind of these extremes, these upper and lower quartiles, is where we see these very defined patterns. And maybe what we need to do really when we're thinking from a public health perspective is actually to probe a little deeper into that middle group to see why do some people who start off the same go on to do better, and why do some people go on to do worse despite being the same kind of at the baseline. I think that would be really interesting to follow up with.
But it is really encouraging to see that the group that we really need to help the most is the quartile that's doing the least.
Yeah.
And so for some of them, just eating a little better, exercising a little more, sleeping a little more, tends to have a bigger impact on their lives than other people. Yeah. So really encouraging that you've got data like that to probe and look into deeper.
Rebecca, this must be quite interesting for you to look at, because obviously when you're looking at some of these groups who are less adherent to a healthy lifestyle, you may not be seeing the same sorts of improvements in some of the research that's done through the Food Foundation. So who do you think these people are, or more importantly, I suppose, who do you think they are not?
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised by these results. They're super interesting, and maybe not what one would expect. Certainly one thing we do know is that for a lot of people, the pandemic was a bit of a sort of sea change moment. And there's lots of sort of evidence from surveys that for a lot of people, it was like, great, this is really going to be a time where I can sort of switch up my routine. So, for example, we know that sales of veg boxes increased by 110% in the first 6 weeks following the pandemic. So there was a sort of a bit of a shift to local, and people maybe sort of focusing on where their food came from a bit more. And we also know that there's lots of reports of people cooking more from scratch. So I think it's probably true that for some people there was this sort of breathing space to make some changes. But I think there are some crucial factors at play here. So time being one of them, as Christopher touched on. And I think again it's interesting that this study sample was tended to be slightly older. So maybe we can assume fewer caring responsibilities, maybe more established in jobs, so without that kind of job stress. And I think also probably quite a motivated bunch of people tracking their COVID symptoms. So maybe slightly more motivated towards sort of changing their food behaviours for kind of healthier patterns. Because, yeah, as you say, we know it's not always been, certainly for a lot of people, making those healthy changes is very much constrained by your own resources and capacity, what sort of built environment, food environment you're in, everything like what's your access to green space to exercise, what sort of food is available on your local high street. So I think, by no means has it been easier for everyone. And I think I'm right in thinking that the effect was attenuated if you were from a more deprived area. So kind of hinting, what will be interesting to see is whether these behaviours persist. So in 6 months' time, are as many people reporting that the healthier behaviours have persisted?
Well, that actually brings us on to an interesting point in that, we've been talking about the experiences had during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, but we're almost a year down the track, and for many of us, and actually all of us here in the UK are in lockdown. So the saga continues. So after so long, do you expect, Sarah, that the disruption people are experiencing has actually compounded over time?
That's an interesting question. It's something we want to answer with the Zoe, COVID symptom study app, and we are going to be relaunching the questionnaire in a couple of weeks. So to everyone out there that's allowed us to generate this amazing data, I would really ask you all, please repeat the questionnaire when it comes out in a couple of weeks. I know it does take more than a couple of minutes to complete, but it's so important to us as nutritional researchers, to public health, to government, etc., to guide us. And I think really to answer the question, does anyone know yet, outside of our COVID symptom study, there has been a study conducted by UCL in the UK where they have tracked people's lifestyle on a monthly intervals ever since the pandemic started in February. Now, they don't ask the same kind of level of detail questions, so we can't really ascertain from them, quite in the same way we can from our study what's going on. But what they have found is that in each of the lockdowns and over time, there's broadly been the same kind of findings as us, where you see that on average, there's no mean population change, but there's huge variability. The only thing that they did find, interestingly, in this second lockdown is that, or third lockdown, as a full lockdown, but that when they looked in the last month, they found that physical activity did reduce. So compared to how they found it remained quite stable, like we did in the first lockdown, they found it significantly reduced. Now, whether that's because everyone's just fed up now with it and they're not motivated anymore, or whether it's because no one can run in the snow that we're currently experiencing in the UK, or the rain that we had last week, or the wind the week before, I don't know. But I'm hoping that by us collecting this data in a few weeks, we'll be able to really untangle a little bit more the effect of multiple disruption events and the longer term effect that's happening due to the pandemic.
Okay, so while we've got the three of you here with your various areas of expertise, I'm going to ask you each for a tip on how to stay healthy under these extreme conditions, because this is a lot of the questions we've been getting through Slido have been around how do I stay healthy? What can I do around sleep? What can I do around diet? So Rebecca, though, I want to start with you and ask, there's still many people, as we've talked about, with reduced access to food. What resources are available to people who are struggling?
So maybe a good place to start with is the End Child Food Poverty website, which basically brings together a whole load of resources on what's available for particularly families that are struggling and government schemes that exist. So I'd maybe signpost towards that. But I think as well, when we're talking about food access, as well as signposting people to resources, we need to think of the broader support that's needed at probably, at a government level to change this. So, for example, the free school meal and healthy start schemes they already exist as schemes, and they support lots of families with young children to access sort of more nutritious foods and enough food. So I think there's a lot that could be done around extending the eligibility of those schemes so that more families can benefit from them.
Great, thank you. And Christopher, we've talked a lot in this webinar about the interconnected factors, all the different things that contribute to that disruption index. Things from the food that we eat to the way that we sleep, and so where would you suggest that people try to focus their energies to improve their health under these conditions within their control and power?
Yeah, that's a perfect way to set me up. So in the health field, we do a lot of what's called motivational interviewing right now and say, how good or bad do you think your diet is? How good or bad is your physical activity? How good or bad is your sleep? Which one are you most willing to change right now? What do you have the opportunity for? And so I would say, instead of trying to fix it all at once, which often fails, if you just really want to focus on sleep, that could snowball. You're sleeping more. Suddenly you actually have more energy to be physically active, and you don't crave carbs anymore. Or because you're eating better, you actually feel better about being physically active. So I would do some soul searching and just say, look, I'm going to be kind to myself. I'm not going to try to fix it all at once. What area do I feel like I have the most room to move in, and that I feel motivated to work on first, and then you could add some behaviors later would be my tip.
Thanks, Christopher. And Sarah, in terms of diet quality, but still under these pandemic conditions, what's your key tip for maintaining some sort of diet quality in the way that people eat?
I think I'd really like to build on what Christopher said. And my key tip, and I often say this to people, is to remember that food's there to be enjoyed. It has social, cultural, emotional links. And I think that we really need to be careful not to get too caught up on individual foods that we consume. We can try to aim for an overall dietary, healthy dietary pattern. So by this, I mean reduce processed carbohydrate-rich foods, increase fruits, vegetables, pulses, whole grain, have adequate intakes of dairy, unprocessed meat, oily fish. But I think most importantly, don't make food your enemy. It is there to bring us pleasure, and try and, incorporate a healthy diet whilst really not focusing, like I say, on an individual food, but think about the pleasure that you can get from your diet and from eating, socially with your family, etc.
Great, thank you. We've got just a few minutes to look at some of the questions that have come in, additional questions that have come in via Slido. We've had a lot around the impact of our diet on our health, and such as this one from Freda. So how can we best improve our immune response generally for those of us who have had COVID? Are there any foods which will help us recover more quickly? I'm not sure, maybe Christopher or Sarah, if you'd like to look into that one.
Well, I can say, I'll jump on it quickly, Sarah, and feel free to add. This is a really challenging area. We have immune stress, we have oxidative degradation, we have antioxidants that we can get in the diet. If you really go into this and look at this, stunningly, what you should do is eat more vegetables and fruits and beans and pulses and less processed. It's all the same thing. You can't go to your clinician right now and get an inflammatory index score. You can't get an immune score. But really all the things that we've said all along, all the things that Sarah just referred to, including the joy, which I would like to emphasize. Find that cultural heritage place where you're enjoying some global flavors and some joy. But if it is a whole food plant-based diet, that gives you a lot of wiggle room. That gives you the fiber for your microbiome, which affects your immune system. So play up that fiber and that fermented food for improving your microbiome, for increasing immune function. It's just your chance to explore where to find the joy and put all those good whole food plant-based components into your diet and allow yourself some wiggle room. Sarah, how would you build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to really say that I agree with you, and to really, emphasize there's no magic bullet. There is no magic single nutrient, single food that is going to cure COVID, prevent COVID, just like, every single disease that's out there. And I think, unfortunately, at a time where we're also worried and we're also desperate to improve our health or prevent particular diseases, it's very easy to get fixated on what unfortunately is miscommunicated in the media, that, there's this latest extract that will cure us of this or prevent this. And I would kind of implore people, please don't, ever think there is a magic bullet. There is no such thing as a single food that is a cure-all. We need to focus on, like Christopher said, whole dietary patterns. We do know, and there is some emerging evidence around some single nutrients and their relationship with reducing your chances of getting COVID and the severity of COVID. So there is some evidence that I think it is worth mentioning around omega-3, which can be found in oily fish, around vitamin D, for example, in reducing our risk. But I think that as a nutritionist, I would always encourage people to try and obtain these nutrients through a balanced diet. And I think as well, to reiterate what Christopher said, is that there is emerging evidence around the microbiome and around a gut-friendly diet. And this is something that, as part of this questionnaire, we did actually calculate. So we've developed at Zoe this gut-friendly diet score. And we are feeding this back to participants who actually completed this questionnaire and giving them their gut-friendly diet score. And what this score tells us is, how many of these good gut-friendly foods they're consuming, and therefore, which we know are related to a healthy microbiome, which we're now seeing this evidence in terms of immunity and actually overall general health as well.